Hey everyone, thanks for coming to my YouTube video. Today we're going to be talking about apps that will be useful for you while you're learning Chinese. I do want to make a complete video series on things that I've used in my journey of learning Chinese, or things that I think might be useful for other people, things that I wish I would have used. Today we're just going to be focusing on apps that were useful for me. I'm sure there are many other apps out there, but I'm just going to talk about the ones that I found really useful for me. The first app we're going to talk about is Hello Chinese. While I talk about the app, I'm going to try to display some screenshots or video capture of the app here, so you can get a better understanding of what it's like there. Hello Chinese is basically a better version of Duolingo. If you've ever used Duolingo before, for example, with the Spanish program, when you look at Spanish, they have the whole course, and then they also have some stories that you can use to read or practice. Hello Chinese is kind of like that, where they have a main course, like a tree, the same way that Duolingo has it set up. And they also have other lessons and stories. Now, some of them require additional payments, and I never paid for any of them, but maybe they'll be useful for you. Some of them are free, so you can get a trial experience with that. Another big benefit for me with learning using Hello Chinese is that it has traditional Chinese characters. And I knew early on that I'd be coming to Taiwan to learn Chinese. So when I started using apps, I tried to find one that had the traditional Chinese option. If you're going to be talking to people from mainland China, or you plan on going to mainland China, Simplified Chinese is just fine for you. In America, most people use Simplified Chinese. However, I knew I really wanted to study traditional Chinese with calligraphy and staying in Taiwan and things like that. Now, Hello Chinese only goes up to about an HSK4 level. There are, let me see real quick. From my research here, my limited research here, it says there are 6 HSK levels. I'm not really sure because we don't use HSK here in Taiwan. I believe that's a test done in Hong Kong and for China. But it says that an HSK4 level is similar to about an A2 or a B1 on the Sepher scale, if you're familiar with that. If you guys want, I can make another video too about some different levels of Chinese and how we can gauge those. But basically, HSK4 or Sepher A2 or B1 would be basically simply conversational Chinese. So you could say maybe introduce yourself, order food, have some basic conversation about topics that are interesting to you. But you likely won't be able to have conversations about like religion or politics or some deeper topics that might be interesting to you. That's not super important when it comes to learning with language apps, because once you get to that kind of understanding, I think there are some better resources that would be more useful for you than just some language learning apps. With that being said, in the future, I will make a video about other resources that I think are useful for me, like maybe books or different websites that you can use to advance your Chinese once you have a basic understanding of the language. I just compared Hello Chinese to Duolingo, and another thing that you could use is, well, Duolingo. So Duolingo isn't bad for Chinese, it's still good, but the downside is that it's really only good for beginner level, and there's no traditional Chinese. So if that's something that you're interested in, I would recommend studying traditional Chinese alongside with Duolingo. That's okay too. The reason the Chinese language course in Duolingo isn't as advanced as maybe the Spanish course is because it was just added later. I believe it was added in 2017 or 2018, something like that. You'll notice if I'm showing you my video recording, I have completed the Duolingo tree. It's because I do think it is useful and it's fun. But again, once you get to an intermediate level, there are some better resources that you can use later on. That's about all I would use for Chinese teaching apps, but there are some other apps that I think are useful for you in addition to those. We'll start with translation and dictionary apps. The first dictionary I really like is Pleco. Pleco is great because it gives multiple uses, pronunciations, and explanations for each and every character. It'll show you the usages that it has, as well as giving you example sentences of those usages. So when you have a character that could have many meanings in your native language, it might be really useful to use Pleco. Some other great things about Pleco is that you can draw the character on the app. Drawing the character is really useful when you don't have a Chinese speaker to read it for you. If you know how to say the character but you don't know what it looks like, you can also type in pinyin. Pinyin is the way to use English characters to type in Chinese. So it's really easy to find the character that you're looking for. Oh, now that I mentioned searching characters, I remember too, on Pleco, there's also a scan function like there is on Google Translate. You can just hold your camera to it and it'll scan the characters for you. It'll read them for you. For advanced users of Chinese, another thing that might be interesting for you is that Pleco has some other dictionaries that you can get in addition to the basic dictionary. There's like classical Chinese dictionaries within Pleco. So if you're studying classical Chinese or higher level Chinese, that might be useful for you as well. Another great thing about Pleco is that it has simplified and traditional characters, so both of them will be available for you. One thing I did mention that Pleco can do for you is it gives you example sentences. I would also recommend finding more example sentences online. If you just search your character, the character that you want example sentences of, and then type in 造句, which means to make sentences in Chinese, you'll get a bunch of websites that will give you example sentences of that character. I find that to be really useful because you can see more examples of how a native speaker would use that word. Sometimes when you read a dictionary, you gotta be careful because although there are many usages that are possible in the Chinese language, maybe only one or two of them are more common. When you look up that character and then the example sentences, most of the example sentences you're going to get are going to be ones that are normal, things that people would actually say. Another thing I mentioned too was Google Translate. I think Google Translate is still a great resource. Actually, one of the benefits of using Google Translate is that when you type in a whole sentence, it'll translate the whole meaning of that sentence. Whereas with Pleco, if you type in a whole sentence, it'll just give you the definition of each character. And then if you have a decent understanding of Chinese grammar, or really if you have a poor understanding of Chinese grammar, you can usually still guess what the sentence is supposed to mean if it's a simple sentence. Whereas more difficult sentences, I would still use Google Translate, but I would double check it with Pleco just to make sure it kind of seems right. So yeah, when it comes to dictionaries and translation, I'll just stick with Google Translate and Pleco. Now there are two other apps that I used while I was studying Chinese. One of them was actually more recently. I use it for studying new words, getting my vocabulary built up. It's called Anki. Anki is very famous in the language community because it's useful for all languages. Anki is basically a flashcard app. It's a way to use flashcards digitally. Another great thing about Anki is that on their website there are free flashcard decks in many different languages. So if you're not just learning Chinese, if you're studying some other languages, you can use Anki for all of those. With Anki, you can also make your own flashcards. It's kind of like Quizlet, but I think it's actually better because it uses spaced repetition. If you're unfamiliar with spaced repetition, we can go into detail with this in another video, but basically, spaced repetition is basically studying a word less and less the more familiar you are with the word. And if you suddenly get less familiar with the word, it'll make you study it more and more. This is a great method for learning vocabulary, and I think Anki is a great tool. I didn't use it early on because it can feel a little bit boring if you're at a basic level. If you already have a decent level, if you already have a decent understanding of Chinese, I think you'll remember the vocabulary words more easily. I think Anki will be less stressful for you if you're learning the words a little bit faster. Another app that I used before is called HelloTalk. HelloTalk's also pretty famous in the language community. HelloTalk is basically a language exchange app. Now there are ups and downs to language exchange because you do have to exchange, so you are giving something and returning in return for that language that you're acquiring. So you will have to speak your native language. But basically with HelloTalk, you sign up as a speaker of one language and a learner of another language. And they'll pair you with people trying to learn your language but are the native speaker of your target language. So for me, I would sign up as like a native English speaker learning, in this case would be Chinese, and they would pair me up with Chinese speakers who want to learn English. It's also kind of like maybe a Twitter or Facebook where there's a feed that you can post to. The benefit of having an app like this is that you get paired with those other language speakers, and it's really easy for people on that app to correct your sentences. So there's a lot of different ways on that app where you can receive inputs and criticism on your language. Well, that's pretty much it for language learning apps that I use. Just to recap, for learning, I'd use Hello Chinese and Duolingo. For dictionaries, I'd use Pleco and Google Translate. And some other apps that I think would be useful are Anki and HelloTalk. I'm sure there are other language learning apps, even for Chinese, out there that are useful, but these are the ones that I used personally while I was studying Chinese. I'm not sponsored by any of these companies. It's just apps that I think are useful for me. In future videos, I hope to touch on more topics like things that I would use in Chinese, but just not relating to apps. If you guys have any other questions about learning Chinese or other language learning questions, feel free to leave those in the comments and I'll try to answer you as soon as possible. Thanks.